back in there.
Where we turned into the
I
refuge.
don't know whatever happened to that thing.
See, that's what Val Green talked about this morning. It's not on.
I think right into here. And in fact, I think we came across Nelson Ferry here, and there was an Indian town just south of Wambaugh Creek down here. And then there was another Indian town, I believe they said it was a long lead, which would be about 3 miles right north of here, and I believe that was right up about I-95 and on the mounds up there. So I think this was the place where Petitecchio was. Just about 4 months ago in Houston Archives Department, I found 1758 plat or land grant. And you got to realize that this lake out here now covers up not only high dry land and swamp and fields and stuff, but also there were other bodies of water out here beside just the river itself. There were a lot of old river beds, old lakes, oxbow lakes and things. And on this land grant I found the other day, which is just south of Wambaugh Creek down here, about maybe 2 miles from here, I found a lake showing on it, oxbow lake showing there, which was called Lake Cados, C-A-D-O-S. It's now called a Kudo unit of this wildlife refuge. It's this next unit down there. So they've changed the word a little bit, but I'm sure it came from the same word. Well, I looked up in the dictionary what Cados means, and it's an old Jewish word for holy place. So the only way that name would have gotten here was that it was given by the Spanish, who probably came in either with De Soto or 26 years later with Pardo. And the Spanish did say that after traveling through Florida and Georgia that this seems like the best place on earth when they got to Petitecchio. So I reasoned that lake was probably named by the Spanish soldiers, the Jewish Spanish soldiers who came in this area with De Soto or even with Pardo.
He was a surveyor. He came up in this area and surveyed.
That's Richardson Cemetery.
When Harold first was burying skin on the back of the swamp over here.
There's a cabin while you're in there. Cabin back there.
Those silver furnishings?
I believe so.
Looks like more like
Francis Marion goes back to about age 10 or 11 when I wrote my first book on Francis Marion, which was about 2 pages long, but it was pretty big, pretty good for a 5th grader. I'm from Ohio originally. Imagine the fact I never dreamed at that time that a few years later, let's put it that way, I'd be in a position in South Carolina to actually do research on Francis Marion. Sort of a lifelong dream coming true. I take a different perspective on Marion. My real interest in Marion not only is from the archaeology, but from the history. But I just really am fascinated by all of the mythology. Francis Marion goes back to about age 10 or 11 when I wrote my first book on Francis Marion, which was about 2 pages long, but it was pretty big, pretty good for a 5th grader. I'm from Ohio originally. Imagine the fact I never dreamed at that time that a few years later, let's put it that way. I'd be in a position in South Carolina to actually do research on Francis Marion. Sort of a lifelong dream coming true. I take a different perspective on Marion. My real interest in Marion not only is from archaeology, but from the history. But I just really am fascinated by all of the mythology behind Marion, and trying to separate that just little tiny kernel of truth out of all of the legends that we know about Marion. What really is Marion versus what are all these interesting stories that Reverend Weems first got us involved with. I know it's late in the day. If you get tired and bored and you have to go for some reason, that's fine. Luther Wanamaker, the owner of the property at Fort Mott, has been wanting to see this. I've been wanting to tell him for a long time what we found there. So we're going to take as much time as I need. It won't be over an hour, believe me. I just wanted, the last time I gave this presentation, I had to give it before an audience of archaeologists. It was like 20 minutes long, so I was going like this the whole time. I really don't want to do that this time. I'll try to slow down a little bit and really get into it. If you want to ask me questions while I'm in the middle of it, please do. I also would like to thank Charles Baxel. Some of the photographs we got from this comes from Charles' donations and his interest in all things Revolutionary War. Fort Mott has got it all in terms of this sort of mythology. It's got intrigue, it's got espionage, it's got probably some romance, and if I have, this is all preliminary work, so I'm sure I can find some sex involved in this whole thing somewhere along the line. It's got everything that you want in a Francis Marion story, and it's got a little history too. And with the archaeology we put together, we got some history there that's actually, we think, is fairly substantial, fairly true. Generally, Fort Mott was a plantation home, and this is Rebecca Mott, fortified by the British during the American Revolution. Brigadier General Francis Marion and Light Horse Harry Lee, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Lee, captured Fort Mott on May 12, 1781, and Luther pointed out today at lunch that was just about to the day of the fall of Charleston, 1 year previous to that. And I want to emphasize again that what you're looking at is raw data that we have produced as a result of getting funding from an organization called the American Battlefield Protection Program. This funds research and planning on Revolutionary War battlefields and Civil War battlefields, and it's under the National Park Service. We were able to get a grant to go in and look at Fort Mott. Now, if you talk to people at the American Battlefields Protection Program, they wouldn't say they were funding research. In fact, they would be very offended that you said that, because that's not under their legislative mandate. So what we're really doing out there, if anybody, if you said, what's Steve Smith doing out there? Well, he's doing the update of the National Register form, which is because the old National Register form for this site is simply the mining up on Buckhead Hill. What we wanted to do, and the way we were able to obtain the fund, was to say, there's a lot more to this site than just the money. And we think we can prove that. And so we were able to obtain the grant to go out there, spend some time as archaeologists, and try to find things on the ground. Okay. Hello, George. There we go. This is going to be a little bit blurry, but give you some historical look at history first. We'll try to throw in some of the legends. I won't go over everything because that would take much too long. But just some basic background. Of course, when Charleston fell in May of 1780, the British immediately pushed into the backcountry, capturing the major, at that time, towns, cities that were important in terms of the control of the backcountry, those being Augusta, 96, Camden, and Georgetown. Now, obviously, in order to control those and the supplies coming from England and other places, they had to go through Charleston and get their supplies on the roads up to Camden and Georgetown. So supplies going up 96 and up to Camden will come along this lower road underneath Santee, and sometimes, of course, they would cross it at Nelson's Ferry, where we live today. There we go. Okay. There's an interesting relationship between Fort Mott and Belleville. Belleville was Colonel William Thompson's, Danger Thompson's plantation, and this actually was the first fortification that was built. in that area. This was an important crossroads, obviously, for supplies getting both to 96 and to Camden. And the first, we can't really know for right now when Fort Mott was constructed, but this is what we do know. The first time that I've been able to find when Belleville was mentioned is in June of 1780, when under Allaire's diary of Ferguson's march up into the upcountry towards what would eventually be the Battle of Kings Mountain. That was in June of 17. They camped there on their way up. And at that time, they camped at at Thompson's plantation. Nothing about a fort. The first time it's mentioned that there's a, quote, post there is in November of 1780. So I'm assuming that by November of 1780, Belleville Plantation was a fortified place. That is, and it's going to be the same thing as we're going to see at Fort Mott, which was a plantation house in which a ditch was dug and earth thrown up against a palisade to form a fortified position. Now, some references will say that Belleville and Fort Mott were occupied at the same time. Yes and no. They were occupied briefly at the same time, probably in April of 1781. But during that time, Fort Mott was being constructed. For some reason, which I have not been able to determine, Belleville was abandoned and they moved to Buckhead Hill. Probably because, which we'll get into in a little bit, that was when the plantation house at Fort Mott was built. It was sometime between November of 1780 and about February of 1781. Okay, now we get into Rebecca Mott, why it's called Fort Mott. Rebecca Mott married Jacob Mott. Jacob Mott, they were a fairly prominent family in the Charleston area. And Mott was from the Calhoun County area at that time. It was not Calhoun County. And she died early in the war. She became a widow. Then her brother, Miles Bruton, because she was a Bruton, also went off to sea, taking his family with him. So suddenly, Miles Bruton, his fortune was, who was it going to go to? It went to Rebecca Mott. And she inherited the Miles Bruton house in Charleston, and we believe she also inherited this property. We haven't traced back the property yet. And some sources, historical sources, say that the Fort Mott property was owned by Miles Bruton. Others say that Jacob Mott owned it. And I'm the type of person who wants to see some sort of historical documentation of either one. So I'm not sure which one it is at this point. In any case, there's lots of good stories about Rebecca Mott in Charleston. She brought her slaves down, or she brought Miles' slaves down from that area into Charleston to help build the fortifications and the defense of Charleston. There are stories of her slaves sneaking out messages between the British lines once they had captured Charleston to Marion and Greene and other people, officers in the Revolution, sneaking messages out about what was going on in Charleston. In any case, in November of 1780, she was given permission to move up to Buckhead Hill. And at that point, she probably began construction at the plantation house, which probably is the reason why the British would then move to that later, at a later point in time, because it was closer to McCord's Ferry, which was a critical crossing point, just like Nelson's Ferry was down here today. Okay, well, you all know that after the fall of Fort Watson, what was that, in April 1781? Well, I want to go back and talk a little bit about Sumter, because Kristen Swagger's here, and I have a great idea for a story, a children's story. Throughout, one of the neat things about this story is throughout what Marion and Lee are doing at Fort Mott, there's this guy in the background going, oh, I want to do it too, I want to do it too, a guy named Sumter. Right? And wherever Sumter goes, he kind of messes up. So, and he first goes to Fort Granby, and of course tries to take that, and he doesn't have a cannon, so he can't do that. So he thinks, I'm going to go south and take it. This time, it was Belleville Plantation. So in February 26 or 28 of 1781, he attacks the fortified position at Belleville. Now, that also tells me that there was nothing at Fort Mott, except maybe some slaves constructing the fortification. It wasn't occupied by that time because he was attacking Belleville. And if there were two British positions within a mile of each other, you would have had some historical record saying, I needed to do something here, but I also needed to send some troops out to make sure that the guys weren't going to get reinforced by Fort Mott. So Fort Mott could not, in my mind, have been constructed in February, at the end of February of 1781, because Sumter did not mention it. He attacked Belleville. Well, he attacks Belleville. Same thing happens. They run across an open field and he gets slaughtered. He comes back and he's thinking about what he's going to do. Let's go to this man. Good. All right, let's go ahead and go here. Belleville is right here. It's on your map. In your, if you look in your brochure, you'll see a pretty good map. You'll even see a little thing that says Thompson. It's pretty blurry right here, but it does say Thompson's. That's Belleville Plantation. Fort Mott is not on the map. It will be right up in here. Just to orient you, we're in the hotel over here. Nelson's Ferry is there. Fort Watson will be here. So, Sumter goes to, tries to attack Belleville Plantation, gets forced out of there, comes down here to one of the ferries, the Imaginals Ferry, and he hears that there's supplies coming up the road. Some sources saying those supplies were going to Camden. Some sources say those supplies, wherever you do anything in the Revolutionary War, if you got something in your mind, read something else and it'll change it, because there's just all kinds of different sources of these things. Okay, someone else says, well, it's actually they were going to Fort Mott. Part of the construction materials that were going to Fort Mott. Okay, in any case, supplies are coming up the road. Sumter attacks the supplies. And guess what? He wins. He captures the supplies. He puts them on a barge, Imaginals Ferry, and he decides he's going to sail down to Fort Watson and take Fort Watson using those supplies. Pretty cool idea. Except that the guide that he hired to take those barges with all the supplies downstream is a Tory. And when the guy gets down close to Fort Watson, he eases the barge over to where he knows there's a British outpost, and Sumter loses all those supplies. Where do those supplies go? They go to Fort Watson. Marion comes along in April of 1781. What's the first thing he does if you read carefully of the siege of Fort Watson?
Captures.
Bingo. They're all hanging around the old mound. Look, you've seen the mound now. You see how small that thing is. People weren't living in there when there wasn't anything going on except the siege, right? They were all camped around outside that fort, along with all those supplies. Who gets the supplies? Marion and Lee. What are they going to do with those supplies? Well, they're going to go back up to Fort Mott and take Fort Mott. So those supplies that came from Charleston go back and forth in each other's hands. Why is that cool? I'll show you a little bit. I just want to that'll keep Christina away for a little bit. Okay. After the fall of Fort Watson in April of 1781, get the supplies, and Marion and Lee separate briefly, and then they're told by Greene to go after Colonel Watson, because he does not want Watson to join up with Walden while he's putting pressure on Walden in Camden. So he tells Marion and Lee, you got a cannon now. There was a neat story about this cannon, and this guy's trying to catch up with Marion and Lee, and they get lost, and there's all kinds of interesting things. Eventually, they wind up with the 6-pounder, which is going to become very important. They cross Nelson's Ferry. They realize that Watson, I'm sorry to say this, Watson outsmarted him. He bypassed him, and Marion and Lee decide to go north to Fort Mott. They arrive there just before another load of supplies, and some dragoons are coming to Fort Mott. Okay, here is Fort Mott. This is from the National Archives. And just a little bit of some background on the fort itself. As I said, this is a fortified plantation house. This is going to be a cool dissertation topic if I can work it into something. If you note, Fort Granby was a fortified plantation house. Fort Balfour was a fortified plantation house. Thompson's Plantation was a fortified plantation house. Fort Mott was a fortified plantation house. So there is some sort of, what would be interesting to find out is this an expedient method, or was this something they say they did, the British did in Europe and other places? Or was this something that was adopted in the Western, to the Western situation? In any case, it consisted of this is looking down on top of the fort. This is Mott's house. You've got a ditch or fosse, which they took the ditch and they threw it up here against a palisade to form this entire palisade, and then they would put abatis, fallen logs, way out here, and makes a pretty formidable fort. Now notice how close the house was to, this is almost, it actually is about 126 feet square. It's not very big. And then they put block houses, that's what these little things here on either corner. So that's how they constructed Fort Mott. I don't really use these, I just like to feel comfortable with my hand. Okay, so it's May of 1781, they arrive, they immediately surround the house, and what's going to happen? Well, there's all kinds of, again, stories about what's happening. First of all, Marion's not in a good mood, because that guy named Sumter had written a letter to Greene. Greene is looking for horses. He wants to construct or develop for lack of a better term, like a legion, like Tarleton's Legion under William Washington. He needs horses to do that. He keeps writing people and saying, give me horses. Sumter, finding a good way to put a little burr under Marion's skins, writes back and says, Marion's men are all about it. I bet you could get some horses from him. So Greene writes this letter to Marion and says, hey, we'll get some horses, and that just really does not sit well with Marion. And he writes back a letter threatening to resist. Actually does. He says, look, when this siege is over, I'm out of here. I'm going to Philadelphia and see if I can offer my services somewhere up north, because I'm tired of working with these, this sort of situation. My men keep leaving me, and we can't keep them long enough to get anything done, because even at Fort Mott, people were leaving even though they were besieging this place. And eventually, at the end of the siege, Greene will come to Fort Mott while it's being destroyed, after the Americans take it, and sort of pat him on the back and say, hey, you're doing a great job, come on, hang on with us. Everything is patched up, and Marion was on his way to Georgetown, basically. Okay, so there's that story going on. There's the militia league. And then they begin the siege. Okay, they surround Fort Mott. They have a mound, which they either construct or it's already there. And they put the 6-pounder on there, 6-pound cannon. And the idea is to rake the north face of this post right here, while they construct a sap, a ditch, towards the fort. Once they get close enough to the fort, they think they can take it. Now here's a picture that Charles Baxley gave me from Mort Kunstler, who's really, it's a really perplexing sort of illustration. You've got Mrs. Rebecca Mott, we'll get into the legend of what's going on there in a second. But here you've got really a pretty darn good image or depiction of what that Fort Mott must have looked like. You've got this earthen palisade against the stockade. You've got the house sitting there so that the British can fire out the windows of the top floor. You've got the abattis in front. That's pretty good. You've got the little block houses. I don't know if you can see those on either end. It looks great. But then he's got this 4-lane highway coming up here, which is the sap. And there's no way Marion had the time, and Lee together had the time to construct such an amazing sap up towards the fort. So I don't know where that comes from, and I'll be interested because Mort Kunstler is usually supposed to be noted for his accuracy and that sort of thing. So where he got the idea that this was going I don't know. In any case, we come to the point of the legend of the story is we can almost always cite it together. What happens? Okay. What happens is one day around the 10th of May at night, just as the British were starting to think all was lost, over the horizon they see the campfires of Lord Rutledge. And both the British and the Americans are going, hey, here comes Lord Rutledge to rescue the troops at Fort Mott. So that hardens the besieged, and morale in the besiegers goes down, right? Because they haven't taken the fort. They realize they're going to have to do something drastic. Now, I would say what's happened is that Rutledge has been pushed out of Camden by Greene, the pressure he put on there. Rutledge decides he's going to retreat back to Charleston. I got a pretty good idea that Rutledge didn't have the faintest notion of relieving Fort Mott. But if you see those fires over there, that's a pretty good indication. This is from Fort Mott, looking across the Congaree Swamp. If you haven't been up there, back way over here is Fort Jackson. You can see for miles. It's a wonderful, wonderful place, wonderful view. So I don't think Rutledge was actually coming to rescue him. He was actually on his way to Nelson's Ferry, which is where he found out that the fort had fallen. And we come to this picture. Okay. All I'm going to say is somehow the fort, Mrs. Mott's house caught on fire. Take your choice. All right? The story is, the brief story is, that they decide that they've got to do something desperate before Rutledge gets there. So they go to Mrs. Mott and say, look, I'm sorry, we're going to have to burn your house down. We're close enough now, we can set that baby on fire. And she nobly hands these arrows and an Indian bow to them and says, here, what was it? If it was a palace, it would be no cause, right? Something like that. And so she offers the bows and arrows. Now, that's where the fun begins. We've heard that they were Indian arrows. We've heard that they were African arrows. We heard that the bow was actually from India, or it was brought from an East Indiaman by Miles Bruton. We have, how did they catch on fire? The other is that they did use did use arrows, but they fired the arrows out of a musket. William James, who's supposed to be our eyewitness and he tells us all these things, is kind of cagey about it. He says, yeah, Mrs. Mott did that, but really the way it caught fire was that Nathan Savage put some brimstone in a sling and slung it up on the roof. I don't really buy that myself. I think it has I'm leaning towards arrows in a musket. That would be probably a pretty accurate way, because you have to understand, it wasn't the 4-lane highway that we saw built. That wasn't they were building maybe a 2-foot wide old thing up towards, as close as they could. They got to the Abattis. That's as close as they could get. And someone in that, Savage would have had to have been brave enough to get out of that ditch and run up there close and sling it up there. Possibly. But it's more likely that they were down in there with their musket and he just kind of like a mortar. The M79, you know about that. And it caught fire. The British goes up on the roof to put the fire out, and Marion and his cannoneers blast the roof with canister. And off come the British. The fire goes up and catches more and more of the house on fire, and then eventually the British realize we're out of here. We got to surrender. Okay, so they do that, and then there's all these stories about the dinner afterwards, and I'm not going to go into all those, but the British and the Americans are entertained by Mrs. Mott either at the house or again over at the tenant house where she was, because she had been living at the house, except when the siege began, she was thrown out of her house and sent over to the tenant's house, the overseer's house, on the other hill, and that's where she was when she was being offered her bows and arrows. So it's an interesting story. Suppose she ran out of her house with the Indian bows and the arrows and ran over to the tenant's house, or did the tenant have the bows over there already? So it gets all mixed up. It doesn't make sense, but it's fun. It's very interesting. All right, so we can almost now turn to the archaeology. Well, I think we'll leave it for that. All right. Again, I don't get to go out there for fun and play around, and I have to have some objectives. The federal government wants to know how the money is going to be spent, and so we come up with some project goals. What we're trying to do is to define the battlefield. In order to do that, we need to come up with some battlefield features. Well, obviously, there's the British camp. There's the fort itself. There's Marion's camp. There's Lee's camp. They didn't camp together. The militia and the Continentals were not getting along, and they camped at different places. There's the artillery ground. That'd be a good feature to find. There's the sap, or ditch, that the Americans dug to the fort. And then we take all that, and for their money, they're getting an updated National Register form. Okay, here's a map, topographic map, looking at the area. The fort is right here, up on Buckhead Hill. That's not very good focus, is it? I'm not sure I can do anything about that. The other hill is where supposedly the Continentals camped. Marion was supposedly camping somewhere in this area on the same hillside as the fort, according to sources. The sap, which the Americans dug towards the fort, had to have been was supposed to be between Lee's camp and the fort, and probably in here, because this would be the closest place where they could dig. And see the topography here is such that the topography here is such that they could hide very easily and get very close to the fort on top of this hill before they had to expose themselves. Now, the monument, artillery position. The artillery position has to be somewhere over here to ring the north face, according to the sources. So this is what we proposed to them. We said, look, we're going to go out and find those archaeologically. So how do we do that? Well, there's lots of these sophisticated equipment we can use. We can use a $10,000 piece of equipment called GPR, ground penetrating radar, which sends the radar signal into the ground, reflects back different images depending on what you run over and the types of soils and the soil disturbance. You can do old-fashioned digging trenches, which we did, and of course metal detecting is a very useful way of expediting archaeological work, especially at military sites, because what we're looking for, musket balls, flintlock parts, gun parts, artillery parts, accoutrement from both the militia and both regular units. So those are all metal, and those are all easy to find. So how did we find Fort Mott? Interestingly enough, we have a monument there, but no one knew whether or not where Fort Mott was. I mean, you know how that goes, right? You go along a highway out here and you get a highway marker that says 15 miles from this location something happened, right? But that doesn't really tell you where you are. We're looking for Sumter's house. We don't really know physically on the ground right now where Sumter's plantation was. Archaeologists will probably tell you, but we haven't had a chance to do that work. So we want to know precisely where things are on the ground. Well, you know, we can use all this sophisticated equipment, but we can get real lucky. We're out there one day with our GPR with this big stuff going across the ground and getting all kinds of really interesting signals. And I noticed that this is all in oats out here, this green grass. And I noticed that the pigs would root up stuff, looking for stuff to eat. And I was talking to my partner and I said, look, you know, there's everywhere these pigs are, there's artifacts. They're probably digging in the features, the historic features, the plantation house features. So that's got to be close. He says, man, yeah, you know, if we could get up on a ladder, we could probably just see all these things and just map them out that way. We didn't have a ladder, but we had a truck. So I got up in the truck. And immediately, just happened to be there at the right time, you can see the fort. My golly, whoever put this monument here had a darn square right in the middle of the fort. You can see this little feature right here. See this dark soil? Good old-fashioned English archaeology, crop marks flying over the ground, you know, at a certain height, looking down when the crops are high, and seeing different soil colors, agricultural colors, will give you features of Roman forts in England. That's how they do it. Well, guess what? It works over here too. So here's our fort route, and we'd be able to start coming down that right away. Well, hey, we got to do that, but you know, we did say we were going to do a GPR survey, so we had to go do it anyway. And so we ran our GPR across the site, and we didn't really get, and I'm sorry, I did not bring some evidence of what that looks like. But for Fort Mott, it really didn't really work well because remember, we have a fort ditch, we have the house, and we have maybe that much open space between. The entire area is full of features, and that's what we got. It's just all kinds of readings. But what you need is, if you're looking for something like this, is you need something, a reading, something clear and unused, something, a reading, you know, that what I'm talking about. In order for you to be able to interpret where the fort is, you need something besides fort. So we happened to run our GPRs. It turned out, as we went back and looked at our evidence, we had run our GPR survey entirely inside the fort. So all we were getting was features. So we couldn't see any differences between our readings of what would occur naturally in the soils without historic features, archaeological features, versus features inside the fort. So
Can I ask you a question?
Yep.
Would you say how big that distance was? Because I didn't get you on the camera. I'd like to have that on the camera. That big. Thank you.
Actually, the lanes we run are about 3 feet, something like that. All right. So we went back to good old-fashioned trenching. Using now, everybody, all the archaeology friends of mine are saying, "If a bulldozer out there, you know where it is now, take that baby out. You can find that thing, get a great picture of the whole fort exposed." Well, that would be nice, but I want to go slower. Because there's a lot of material here. There's you go up there, there's ceramics and all kinds of good stuff up there. So we went a lot slower. We worked with because we were just surveying. We wanted to. This site is not going to be a Walmart on top of this baby for a long time. So it's there, it's preserved, it's well protected, and this is the type of site you want to do slowly and correctly rather than just get in there real quick with something. Okay, so we opened up trenches, and we just had a 50-centimeter wide trench, and we just ran those things set up a grid, you know, stuck a stake in the ground, called that 500 north, 500 east, and just started doing systematic trenching across the site. We started opening up units and coming across the ditch, and here's a picture of the ditch. Here's the natural soils, nice sandy yellow soils. When you get to the ditch, it becomes real dark red, hard clay. Now, an archaeologist would go, how does that happen? We kept thinking, well, something wrong here because we're in the subsoils, but there's artifacts in the subsoils. Okay, well, out there what you have is about 20 to 30 centimeters into the ground, a foot and a half maybe. This upper part is topsoils, plow zone soils, soils where we grow crops. Below that is those paleo soils, those very ancient soils, and they're hard, red clay. Well, when they dug the ditch out, and they dug it deep, what were they using? What was the palisade made of? It was made out of that hard, red clay, thrown back up there. When the Americans tore down the fort afterwards, they put the dirt back in the hole, it was hard, red clay, plus artifacts. So this is what you see for your ditch is this hard packed soils, and you see the little layering in here where the palisade steps would have been, but this is the ditch. This is what we're looking at. I'm sorry it's out of focus. It looks really good on this screen if you want to come by later. We decided to cut a trench or intersect the trench itself to get a profile of the trench. Of course, we want to look in there and see what it looks like, see how it compares to what we would see from the map, from the engineer's drawing. And here's Jim Legg, my colleague. If you want to see an artist at work, this is Jim Legg. You can cut a profile. You can see very straight, and you see the differential filling of the profile here, with the strata coming down. This is what archaeologists love, because it tells us something about the filling of facilities. More than likely, what happened here was the Americans were in a lot of hurry, and they just did enough of the fort in order to make it unusable, and then moved on. And later, more slumping occurred, and more dirt came in there as we went from a house site to an agricultural site. Unfortunately, there was nothing in this portion of the trench except the cattle. The British were eating beef. Here's our profile that we dug. And a good archaeologist, that's why I'm not in the trench, that's why Jim was there, can actually, in this case, feel out the soil differences between the subsoils, which have not been touched by the British, versus the soils that were touched by the British. Because remember, this is red against subsoil red. So it's just red and red. So you couldn't really do anything but feel the difference in the texture of the soils to get this profile. But you can see this is the outside, this is towards the fort, Fort Mott and the house, and this is the American side, this is the British side, and you can see a shallower escarpment, counterscarp here, a much steeper angle here. If anyone would actually want to attack this fort, they could slide down this pretty easily, but then they find themselves at the bottom of a hole, pretty sharp slope coming up. And again, here's our layering distribution of the soils. Okay, I just wanted to compare that with what we see here. They have, the engineers draw it as a flat bottom trapezoid, an upside down trapezoid, whereas actually it was much more of a sloped in triangular sort of excavation. All right, we tried to find the sap. We didn't find it. We tried the GPR to find it. It didn't help us any. We tried going out along the hillside slope area to try to intersect the sap, the American Trench, towards the fort. We haven't found it. It's not, that doesn't mean it's not there, it's just that we just haven't found it yet. It'll take more work. That's the battle cry of all archaeologists is, we need more funding. It takes more. Okay. Obviously, the best way to find these sites is with metal detecting. We had Jim Legg, who's an archaeology colleague there, who's a metal detector guy. And I was out there with my machine, and we had another guy out there, Brett Cullen, who's a metal detector person, and expert, 30 years worth of experience in doing this. Somewhat illegal. I'm in Christina. Okay, here's a topographic map looking down on the various things we found. Now, we never found Marion's camp either on the slope of the hill. And we're coming to the conclusion that probably we will not find it because there probably was no such animal. Marion really didn't have enough men at this time, certainly less than 200. I suspect he had between 80 and 100 guys out there. And so I think most of them were deployed surrounding the fort. What we did find were areas, we searched the entire area using the metal detector. Around the fort, we did it systematically, and I'll show you how we did that. Beyond the fort, we got more in terms of, as an archaeologist working over these things for many years, you start developing ideas of where you should be looking and hitting these areas, more sampling survey. Okay, so we found 1, 2, 3, 4 areas that of concentrations of musket balls beyond the fort area itself. Now this looks crude. What you're looking at is GPS data, raw data. We haven't made it nice and neat and look nice. My colleague Jim Legg would be appalled that I'm showing you this because he wants always to look at just like a Stan South archaeology program. I prefer the raw data to give you the feeling that this is how the real world looks when you really do GPS work. You don't get the nice kinds of stuff you want. This is what the fort looks like if you walk the moat. It's not nice and square, it's just a little raw. These are the roads that are out there today, sort of a way to balance out things. We found the base of Mrs. Mott's chimney. I won't go into that much, we'll save that for next year. This is where we put our profile, and we found these areas. Okay, this area here is where we think the battery was, the mound. Unfortunately, the mound is no longer there. However, there are old aerial photos that show features on the ground. This is from 1948. There's a 1938 map, aerial photo, which I don't use here because it's got writing all over it. And one of the things that's got written on it is, this thing here is called the Battle of Fort Mott. So what we think this is the old mound where Marion put his six-pounder. This is from Lossing's book on when Lossing was there in the 1840s, I believe it was. The mound is still there, and he described it and also what the other features. And we talked to Mike about the fact that that drawing there of Lossing is, if you read it, it's actually Mr. Love's house. It's not Mrs. Rebecca Mott's house. In any case, so what we did was we projected this onto a topographic map, got ourselves a UTM, Universal Train Coordinate, north, south, east, west, using the GPS unit, and then GPSed our way to that location. Didn't find anything. It would be a very nice feature for previous relic collectors to have found, and probably pretty well cleaned it out. Don't know. Maybe we'll be expanding that area to try to find it. This next area I want to look at is Area 4 up here. And we found something up there that's probably, I think, for me, it's the neatest thing we found. This here is a musket ball with a nail in it. Does that surprise anybody? Anybody know anything about that? When I think it was either Clinton or Howe was chasing George Washington through New York, the British came through an American camp, and they found these things in the American camp. This is a terrorist weapon. This is not according to the rules of civilized warfare. And the British general wrote an indignant letter to George Washington and said, how dare you use these things? This is contrary to civilized warfare. And George Washington wrote back an equally indignant letter saying, how dare you accuse us of using something like this? Well, they were using it at Fort Mott, whatever, and it actually may have come out of the cannon. So we may actually have some idea of where that mound is afterward. Maybe it's in Area 4, and that's why they have this. But in any case, this is a nail stuck in and you can imagine what that would be. So, yes?
I know during the Civil War, and maybe at this time, with cannon, a lot of times, if you ran low on ammunition, especially if you were trying to fire a canister,
yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
You simply threw whatever was at hand, including possibly construction nails, from the house side into the cannon and fired it off.
Oh, sure, absolutely. And I think that's why I want to look at our GPS data again and see if somehow, we have a NAD 25 versus something else problem, which we're moved where our GPS location should be. Maybe it'll put us right on top of Area 4, which will tell us that actually two things. One, the aerial photo is wrong. Whoever labeled that was wrong. That feature that shows up on the aerial photo is not the mound. I mean, we're looking down on something that just sort of is there. Someone might have assumed that. And number two, Area 4 is actually where the mound was. So that makes sense. I was just thinking about that. There's both British and the British brown best ball and American rifle ball there too. So it's we can't say really who.
Just out of curiosity, I would think that would be awfully hard to fire out of a musket. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Or to load into a musket, for that matter. Is it possible that it's simply a freak of battle where the ball went into a wood structure and picked up a nail?
No way. No, it's cut. It was prepared that way. Okay. Area, I think it's it's so out of focus here. I'm sorry. Can't even see it. Another concentration of musket balls. I want to talk about this area here because it comes into Smith's house. Everybody kind of knows a little bit about Levy Smith. Levy Smith was an intelligence officer, so to speak, a militia officer with the Walden. He was known to have passed messages around. At least he was accused of that, let's put it that way. He was a loyalist in any case. He leaves a remarkable account of his exploits, what happened at Fort Mott, because he was one of the people that almost was hung. After the battle, The next day, the Continentals primarily start dragging people out of Thompson's barn, people who have been recognized by the Continentals and by Marion's men as having loyalist sympathies or known that they've done something. And one at a time, there was about 3 of them hung. Pretty nasty stories of these guys being dragged up to the fort while the fort, some of the soldiers are working on destroying the fort. These people are being hung on Mrs. Mott's gatepost. And Levy Smith, someone comes up, Lieutenant Fulper was one of the first hung, and then someone else comes. Well, sure enough, knock comes on the door, and someone goes, "Is there Levy Smith in there?" Well, by this time, he's got to try to figure out what's happening. They drag him up to the fort, and he pleads for his wife and son to come and see him one more time. He's pleading for his life. And this is an interesting thing in that here's a non-Reeves story, at least, where Marion comes to the rescue, comes up there and sees that these people are being hung, and says, "What are you doing?" And they said, "We're hanging some of these loyalists." And he said, "Damn it, I command here, I'll tell you that. You don't know what's going to happen. If you hang this guy, someone else is going to hang that's captured by the British." I mean, he had actually already worked out an exchange for one of the people that was captured at Camden to be exchanged for Levy Smith. Levy Smith describes his house as being about 300 yards downslope from Fort Mott. That's about 300 yards. And right here we have a whole bunch of domestic material dating to the 18th century. So we think we have Levy Smith's house. Okay, I'm sorry again that this is not as well focused as it should be. This is a distribution map of musket balls we found around Fort Mott. Again, here's the fort. The black lines are the areas we covered very systematically. When I say systematically, we covered it in lanes with our metal detectors. And then someone else came up behind them and did it again. A fairly thorough search. And what we have is a very nice distribution of musket balls showing some pattern recognition, kinds of activity you can see. Around the camp, around the fort, these red musket ball locations, and these were put in with a total station, so we have their precise location down to the 100th of an inch. Not that we really need that kind of precision, but with a total station, it just keeps telling everything. It's a fantastic piece of equipment. Anyway, you notice all the red-fired American rifle balls, the British fired brown best balls out here. So you can see how they were firing at each other throughout the siege and where these things were landing. There's also a piece right here and a piece over here on this side of canister that we found. They were firing a cannon at the roof while the British were trying to defend. And there was also other unfired ammunition, brown best balls, unfired British brown best balls inside the fort. So the distribution is still there despite years of plowing and that sort of thing. We've got good distribution on the musket balls. Looks great. Here's another example of it. Since it's so fuzzy, I just took some of the lines out to show you, try to see better the distribution. Unfortunately, again, it's so out of focus. So we have rifle balls from the Americans. We have the British brown best balls here, more rifle balls up here. We have canister. We have gun flips. And this is where I think will be a fun story to tell, because this is a classic French gun flip. How did it get there? Well, the most logical way it got there was that the militia, the Royalist militia, which were there, probably brought it there. It was found right at the fort. But wouldn't it be interesting if it was an American musket gun flip? How that would have gotten there? But the only way that would have gotten there, if it was an American gun flip, was it was brought from France. The Americans bought this stuff from France to Charleston, put in a keg, shipped up, captured by Sumter, taken to Fort Mott, or taken to Fort Watson, captured by Marion, and then brought up there and lost back at Fort Mott again. So that'd be kind of a nice route. Its route was eventually to go to Fort Mott And this is this whole story you can tell about this gunflint. This gunflint got there. And it's a very plausible, logical story. It could have happened that way. This is much more of a typical British gunflint. Anyway,
What was that last thing you said?
the previous one was...
Much more typical what?
This is more typical Spall type gunflint you find a British gunflint. This is a French gunflint.
Yeah, but the one on the left is still French.
Yeah, but it's the British. Actually, no, I think it's not honey. It's not a honey. It looks like it's a honey colored flint, but it's not. It's gray.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Anyway, Lee's supposed to be camping over here somewhere in the overseer's house, near the overseer's house. The sources say that he was camped near the overseer's house where Mrs. Mott was. So we went over there, and I don't know if we have it or not. We have found a 18th century site. We've got kettle fragments, flattened musket, knife handle, more knife, rifle, tiny little rifle ball, flattened, or pistol ball, excuse me. And this thing here, which is really also very cool, this is a dragoon's pommel from a dragoon's saber.
Could I ask you to stop for a second while I change the tape?
Pardon?
Could I ask you to stop for a second while I change the tape? My
Oh.
tape's coming to an end.
Well, I'm not done anyway.
Well, I have 2 minutes left, so let me...
You ought to do is look at it on here. It's very crisp on the screen there.
Go ahead.
Is there any chance that that is a swan shot or a buckshot rather than a pistol ball?
Man, do you know what a swan shot is?
Yeah.
What is it?
It's about a number 2.
It's a pretty big.
It's pretty good size.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out what it is because there's the dictionary definitions vary radically.
Yeah, it's close to 30 caliber.
Yeah, well, but others people say it's smaller than that. I don't know what it is, but Marion actually ordered a lot of swan shot. You can find records of him asking for more swan shot. You got Val?
Is there any chance any of these artifacts might have come from a slightly earlier time?
Yes, or later.
Because
that area was
William Thompson was an Indian trader.
right.
He may have had and the name of that buckhead is a slang term from Indian time.
Right.
So
There are a
had
few-
trading posts there.
There are a few ceramics, but not a lot. I don't think there was a major Indian occupation on that hill. Maybe on this hill. Actually, we walked that hill to plowed fields, and we found 2 tiny pieces, tiny sherds. There was lots of campgrounds there, both before and after Fort Mott was there. The British came back there later when they were heading towards Utahville. That's why I don't know if this is. I know what happened on top of Buckhead Hill is the result of the siege of Fort Mott. I'm confident of that. What happened over this other hillside could have been earlier, could have been later. This is definitely a good say pommel. And we found the pattern for it. And it's exactly.
Did you do a caliber analysis of those balls?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Are you going to share that with us?
No, because I don't have it with me. No. You can look at it. All right, that's it. That's all my slide. Yeah, I know what you're talking about, and I know I've been debating this swan shot idea for a long time, and it's really. I can find a different definition of this swan shot, depending on the dictionary. If you go, I've looked at historical dictionary. I don't know what he was talking about. We used a lot of, the Americans used buck and ball constantly. There's buck and ball all over the Camden battlefield, and most of those are a lot smaller. We also found, again, I did bring some artifacts. We did find the buckshot, and this is larger than the buckshot you see out there.
Buckshot's usually around 32 caliber.
Other questions?
Yeah, what is the swan shot?
Yeah, it's between a pistol ball in size and the buckshot, which is very small. They used to put like 3.
So it could have been shot out of the cannon, you mean?
No, it was still fired out of the musket,
Oh, okay.
but it was just a heavier.
Okay.
Pardon?
With the musket ball, 3 or 4 swan shot, it's described in some of the stories about Francis.
Yeah, absolutely. He was using buck and ball, and there is buckshot out there. There's no doubt about that. whether or not, what my only reluctance, I agree with you, I think it's probably the swan shot, but I can't get a good definition of what swan shot, especially the difference between what we think of as swan shot today and what was swan shot then. I'm not going to get into that. But we can call it what we want. Yeah, it makes no difference in the interpretation. But I think we're finding them at Camden, probably the both sides are using, both the British Royalists and the Americans are using the flagship. Yeah.
Yeah, what's the status of this study now? Is it complete? Are you still in the middle of it, or what's the next step?
It's still ongoing. I got to write a report by December. And hopefully to enable some way to think of something else to do that they have fun, so we can
Right. What is the status of the artifacts that you find? Where are they?
They're right over there. Some of them, not all of them. They will be hopefully going to the Institute, and hopefully there will be, I think there's some talk about making a display. That's up to the land. I'm sorry. I need my liberty out of giving a headache. Any other questions?
That's incredible. Well, and it was straight, so it goes straight out.
I don't know if
from
it was
the gun?
straight when they were using it, if they bent it on purpose or not. I don't know that for sure.
Probably bent when it hit.
Yeah.
This hasn't been fired.
Oh, it has not?
No, it's not.
The rocket, well, it had likely not.
Oh, it hasn't been fired.
No, it was dropped.
So you just saw it there.
I'm really disappointed about the slides because it's very good on the. I was trying to get up on the screen that got messed up.
The maps.
You can see the maps show very nice distribution between fired musket balls, unfired British balls around the fort. They dropped them.
Oh, really?
Fired British musket balls out about 300 yards where the Americans were hiding, popping up and shooting. A bunch of fired rifle balls right around the blockhouses.
Yeah.
You couldn't see that very well because it's so blurry. There's a little key down there that shows.
Right.
it.
So we can look forward to the publication.
Bring it with you next year so we can all buy it.
Because I will get anyone
Yes,
You know,
absolutely.
in Africa, they break the legs off the pots and use them.
I know, I've heard it.
Yeah, I've seen it done. I hunted in Africa they did it back in the 80s. Saw some examples of it.
Did you clean them?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because you don't have to take them out because the oil will get on your hands. But look at that. Isn't that amazing? Now, what is that?
I'll tell you what's amazing about this, to me.
He showed me down
The entire hill is just full of iron objects.
Well, do you think they're the iron objects from
Well, most of
farming?
them, yes.
Yeah, from
There's
farming,
a
the
whole bunch.
railroad.
There's a whole bunch of railroad spikes up there, and they were just all over the place. Well, my metal detector doesn't discriminate; it just hits something. So I couldn't even use my metal detector up there. We had to use the one that could block out iron. This is iron. I would go out there and I'd work for about.
Oh, it's pretty heavy.
I would go out there and I'd work about 2 hours and get frustrated because I'd dig up nothing but these iron things. And I managed to find this.
How on earth? How could you tell?
Really lucky.
Was it
No, I just dug everything up.
you just dug everything up that was
Well, that would have been out of a canister, right?
This is out of a cannon. Yeah, this would be fired.
Oh, out of a cannon? I thought they'd be big.
No. They did fire. Two kinds of rounds came out of the cannon at that time. Solid shot, which you could use to against personnel, but you'd have to get a nice enfilade along a line to get anything done. What they would do is you'd bounce it in front of them.
Oh, and then it
bounce
would
up,
go.
and it'd just keep going. A much more effective, short range would be like a shotgun, which is with these things either in a can, or if it was in a canvas or in a cotton bag, it would be called grape shot.
So it'd be many pieces of those?
A bunch of these in a can.
I see.
You put it in the cannon, you fire it, the can comes out, explodes, and what you've got is a bunch, about, 20 of these going down range like that.
And as they go down range, they spread out, just like
like
a shotgun.
buckshot,
Yeah,
something like that.
except they're big and they knock people down.
Huh. That's
And they really knock
amazing.
people down.
Yeah, I mean, that is amazing. It doesn't explode, it just knocks them, or puts a hole in them or
Yeah,
something.
and so they were firing this at the roof. You know, from that range, they fired at the roof, and nobody's going to run up there.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That is fascinating.
Steve,
And so what is this
look
one?
about the mound. I know I did knock the mound down. I'm absolutely positive.
Now, what is this?
Sure, right.
Okay, what is that to?
That's a musket ball.
That's a musket ball.
Yeah,
That's a cannonball.
That's just that's not a brown best ball.
Isn't that amazing? Oh, you've got two of them.
Yeah, we got two.
Fabulous.
Unfortunately, we got one on either side of the fort.
Oh, really?
I would like to have had both of them on the north face, so it fits the historical description. You know.
Right. Yeah.
Probably what happened was one of them hit the house and bounced off or something. You know?
Right. Yeah. Right.
So we still don't know what her house looked like.
Well, we can know a little bit about it once I get back in here and do some more digging. I did find
brick.
I found the brick. You saw that.
You saw the brick.
The problem with that brick is,
It's funny brick.
well, it's got what looks like a nice firebox in it, but we also probed it, and it goes right down in there. And I can't imagine a brick fireplace holding that up a two-story house on soft ground. I mean, it would just sort of.
Oh,
So it could be the cellar that this be someone, you know, in the National Register nomination, somebody says there's a cellar up there. Where they got that, I got no idea.
Well, don't you suppose there'd be a cellar and then they have those
cooling.
curved things?
Yeah.
You know, and then the house began.
Cellar is
Woo, woo,
I
woo,
keep telling you, on about 50 feet off of the house.
Could be.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I could see the ground slumped.
That may be the site. You need to show me that again, so we'll go right down on top of it.
Okay.
Well, now, what's going to happen? Because you dug those beautiful trenches and stuff, and then you filled them back in. You're going to have to dig them up again?
No.
Well, if we go, yeah, you will.
I mean, if we wanted to do the thing.
Yeah, I'm like, you know, some people say we should just strip it all back and you'd be able to get a really nice picture of the entire fort.
Yeah.
If we do that, we'll never be able to not undo it, you know? I mean,
What do you mean? You
well,
would never
There'd be
be
nothing left for the next archaeologist to find.
yeah,
People have already
it's
destroyed the
pretty,
site.
It's pretty drastic.
Oh, you mean strip the whole site back to 3 feet or 2 feet or something and sift everything?
Dig the whole thing out.
Yeah,
Right.
but I would rather do it very slowly in sections so we can learn. Well, we're never going to have $300,000 to do that, for one thing.
Did you see that?
Did you find the trench that they dug to the well? That should have been identifiable.
Oh,
That's
that they
fort.
dumped in the well. I always wondered, did you find the well?
No.
See, I found a lot of shards of stuff, but no trash, like stuff.
Sumter says there was a well there, but they were
Well.
digging a well. He writes a letter saying they're digging a well.
Sumter.
He says that probably around April, I think he writes a letter saying they're digging a well at Fort Mott, and he doesn't think they're going to find anything getting the water.
Right.
Well, that's probably true because those people out
You'd
at
have
Fort
to go down
Mott.
forever to get
Yeah.
water there.
I mean, I think Hydrick Winch's well is something like 400 or 500 feet. Some ungodly amount of feet.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's on the curve of the road going to St. Matthews, and that's not on the bluff.
Doesn't Lossing mention them having dug a trench to a well or to get water or something?
They did that at Fort. You might be thinking of Fort Watson.
Maybe, I know.
Yeah, they did that at Fort Watson. I don't remember any part of the siege having anything to do with a well. That wasn't really critical.
So you.
And I said to him, Richard, I'm coming down here. I don't know if you know much about this. Is the 225th anniversary of the Southern Campaign, and I know, frankly, having been up to most of the battles, like the one in Saratoga, where it was very well done and orchestrated and documented, most people up in our neck of the woods look at the wars around Princeton and Trenton and the Northern Campaign. And frankly, in the 2 years that I've come down here, the first year coming down to fox hunt in Aiken, one fox hunting, the First City Troop formed as a group of men from Philadelphia and the Gloucester County Hunt Club out of New Jersey. And so the original uniform has a bucktail or a foxtail. So fox hunting and the history of the Light Horse Cavalry means a great deal to me. And so the bus trip today, looking at these swamps and the dike systems and whatnot, I look at it from a cavalry standpoint, and certainly from an infantry standpoint, it's been a quagmire, thinking of the heat and the attrition of the troops on both sides. In any event, I said to him on the phone, it seems to me that I may have an opportunity to go to this Francis Marion Symposium. I might be able to get some answers to why I think the South needs to be represented at this center. And he said, well, he was on the speaker phone with his committee people, and they said, yeah, we think it's a good idea. Why don't you see what you can find out? And so I called, and fortunately I was allowed to come down here, and in talking to various people on the bus and asking questions, Steve highlighting things about archaeology, it became readily apparent that I was hopeful at least that I could inquire and in touch with the symposium sponsors and folks like you, if in fact things evolve that this area, Virginia, South Carolina, and certainly Georgia, because of it being the 13th colony, Oglethorpe, the involvement with the Spanish repelling them, as I was saying earlier to Tom, that, my God, if the Spanish had be able to come up in Oglethorpe, hadn't raised Carolinians to repulse that, the Revolutionary War may have been a mute issue in terms of these folks coming up through South Carolina. Anyway, I'm hoping that something will come out of this. This is a wealth of knowledge. You could say I'm a Yankee, but I went to school down south, so it's good to be back here. And I hope that I can follow up with some questions with you all later. Just one other quick question. When I brought down a book of standards and colors of the American Revolution, this is through the Pennsylvania Society of Sons. It has
questions?
I'd be interested in what the panel or the group that's left here has to say about Indians participating with the either the Patriots or the Tories during this period.
Is Scott Withrow here? Or has he left? Christine, you were?
Well, many Catawbas fought with Francis Marion. According to some references, 25% of Marion's men were black. Some were free men of color, some were escaped slaves, and some were slaves of men who rode with him. And at least one of them was his own slave, and possibly maybe more. I'm not sure about that. But in addition to that, Catawba Indians also rode with Marion. I guess the Cherokees were the enemy.
George, I guess you got a personal story about that. I have a native ancestor who's in some history documents. His name was Daniel Eady, and he received a pension after the Revolutionary War. And I know that he lived down, down for a while down on the south side of the Santee River, or the west side, we call it. And he was listed as a cobbler in McCann, how do you say it? The guy that built the tower at Fort Watson. And he was listed as being in his battalion, brigade, regiment, I don't know what he had. But this man, Daniel Eady, was listed as being in that group, and he got a pension after the war. And he's listed as a person of color in the census records. And I'm fairly certain he was a Santee Indian.
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier, there definitely New River and 35 of his men fought with Sumter on the 6th of August at Hanging Rock. So we know that, and of course we know about the Catawbas that were in the defense of Charleston, the original defense of Charleston, when they drove off the British. They were used as essentially snipers out on that point to keep Cornwallis from crossing. There were obviously other places because there was a delegation sent from Charleston to the Catawba in 75 or 6 to make sure of their loyalty, because they were saying without the Catawba we don't have much of a chance.
I asked for Scott Withrow a little earlier because he's done some work on some people that sociologists often call triracial isolates, supposedly of Indian ancestry at least, if not themselves recognized as Indian tribes, from around Sumter County, that he says were riding with Marion. He's tracked some names, some of the people's family names, and found that some of these people had volunteered with Marion as well. But almost all those people have migrated. As more and more people moved into the area where they were living, they're called isolates because they try not to live near anybody else who's going to be looking down on them. They kept moving west and so disappeared from the pages of our history. But he had a paper suggesting, at least a reference within a paper suggesting that there was a good bit of this associated with Francis Marion as well. A number of them. Bob, you got a question?
Was that, am I correct, the term legends? And I think we have a dentist in Ellery who traces his ancestors to that mixture of Indian, Native American kinds of things. Am I in the right term, legend?
Portuguese.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, this is another group. This, you sound like you know something about this.
Yeah,
Dave.
I ran into that one. I got ambushed by that one time. That has nothing to do with Francis Marion and the Swamp Fox, but I got ambushed into that. I wrote a book for Fort Polk, Louisiana, on their history, and I was at a conference, and I had they had some legends in that area, which they also was known in that area as Red Brains. And
That's one of Scott's.
they, according to legends of that, they were pirates with Jean Lafitte, and there was just all kinds of mixtures of Portuguese, French, and so on and so forth. And they were quite upset that I didn't believe that story. So.
Well, the ones in East Tennessee, claim to be from that, from that Portuguese colony in South Carolina that disappeared.
West White collected all the information in public records in South Carolina on surnames in South Carolina who were associated with persons of color, Indians. And the book was published by Teresa Hicks, called Indians and Indian Traders of South Carolina, and I think another title. It came out about 4 years ago, and she printed it herself. She printed a limited number of copies, and they sold all out. You can't get one anymore. But if you want to know if you had a connection to any Indians in South Carolina, you have a very good chance of finding it, that book by surname, listed by surname, and all this came from official white man records. So it's not a dubious.
Untrue.
Well,
Is that a hand back in the back?
Yes, sir. Just want to add something to what Val is saying up there. I saw Wes White last week. He came into the archives of the Historical Society, and he comes to consult his own papers. He donated his rather extensive collection of Native Americans to the South Carolina Historical Society. So if anyone wants to come and take a look at some of the work he's done, please let me know. I'd be glad to take you into archives and pull out whatever you need. Val, how do you say his new name? It's Cochran?
No, it's like
He took a Indian name.
something like that.
Yeah, but anyway, it's under Wes White's papers, so if anyone wants to look at that, please let me know.
We had a question again about the book, wasn't the title of the book?
Indians and Indian Traders of South Carolina, Teresa Hicks.
Yes, sir.
The term brass ankles.
Mhm.
What does that actually denote?
Anybody want to tackle that one?
That's all the ice plates that are there from down here around White Rock. Berkeley County, I guess that is there. I listened to someone talk from that group one time, and he said that, but he said when he was a boy, there were people who knew who they were, and now they're all dead, so they don't really know who they were. But in all probability, they're just small pockets of people, mixed bred people who managed to survive outside of the major white society around them. And they hired themselves out as laborers or farmers. If you look carefully at the census records of South Carolina through the whole 19th century, you will see these people show up as persons of color. You can identify thousands of them. I'll guarantee you that if you're a South Carolinian in this room, and you've been here since before the Revolution,
you're probably married into some of those families.
The other term, of course, Somerville Indians. Same thing, brass ankles.
And there are groups like this scattered at least all over down the East Coast. And in many cases, apparently, some of the same families that have migrated in stages all the way to Texas at least. But that's probably another story for another conference. And I think for the eastern states, it's very fascinating when, given what happened to most of the Indian peoples of these regions and to the fact that most of these peoples in the coastal area did not live in large tribal communities at the time of contact, and so were fairly easy to disperse and disappear from the pages of recorded history, but that doesn't mean people won't leave. So I think that's probably something worth a conference in and of itself at some future point. Of course, tied into this is the tradition in Sumter County of a population of people called Turks, who claim in part to be descended from a supposed Turk who was a member of Thomas Sumter's band. So we get right back to that one again, and I guess I'll just not go with another plug there and just let that go. Charles, do you have any contribution on Ben Ali?
No, you're not going to suck me into this brass like this. As a reformed politician, I know where ice is thin, and I'm going to let the experts have that.
Okay, well, at any rate, we had a little bit of a discussion this morning on the question of why individuals would come out and fight, and this is something that kind of interests me a good bit. We talked about what happens when the British take Charleston. We talked about John James going to Georgetown to find out just what Henry Clinton's new proclamation meant. If you read it carefully, that which Doug Crutchfield said was one of the stupid things the British did, and certainly turned out to be so, sounds like he's trying to be nice. He's trying to take off all the restrictions he had on people, everything is settled. But then when you try to go in and figure out what this really means in practice in terms of what I'm going to be expected to do and whatnot, we get a British captain drawing his sword, we get John James picking up his chair to fend off the sword bearer, and all of a sudden Williamsburg County rising. Who are these people doing the rising? Are they the same ones that later are going to join loyalist units? We find so many occasions of the same names popping up on different sides, and it's got to raise questions. Why are they doing this? What is it that's motivating people to participate, to come when Marion or Sumter says come, and maybe later, who knows, when Benjamin Thompson or Wilbur Doyle or John Watson says come. Anybody have any, Chris, you got any ideas on this? I know you've looked a lot into these kinds of stories.
Well, being a descendant of loyalists, born and raised in Canada,
My wife too.
I think there were a lot of reasons. And I think the brutality of the loose cannons in Cornwallis's outfit turned a lot of people against the British. I just got a book on the British Army, not Fortescue's, I've ordered that one too, but on the British Army, and they were describing the British Army in the Revolution, and it said, courtesy and mercy is, no, I think that ought to be R, but anyway, it is awarded to equals, and the Americans were not considered equals. No. Well, and then you had the differences of churches. People who were the Church of England thought that all of the dissenters were going to go to hell, and they wanted to help them along the way. And there were just lots of reasons. But and then in the back country, those people that had land, the Scots-Irish had land for the first time, and it was theirs, and they didn't intend to lose it. There were just many, many reasons why people would fall out. And as for changing allegiance, Walter Edgar said it depended on who was camped in your front yard. And I can believe that too, you know. And I think Frank made that point yesterday with Musgrove.
I've suddenly been overwhelmed with an urge to defend the Anglicans. In Charleston, 3 of the 5 Anglican ministers were pro-revolution, which was not like it was further north, of course. Seabury and those guys, of course, were all
loyalists. A lot of
loyalists.
your Episcopal churches in the South were burned also.
Okay.
There was one Anglican who was not pro-revolution,
And that was a Reverend Charles Woodmason.
But that's 67, 68, 69,
He
yeah.
got a lot of backcountry on the eve of the
Yeah,
Revolution.
that's 5 years earlier, 6 years earlier.
That's 68, 69.
Right.
Okay, and Charles did not want to jump into the Bin Ali question, but he wants to say something about loyalty, patriotism, and filial devotion to country. I'm not sure this is a mark of a wise ex-politician, but I'm going to give him the rope. Charles?
Thank you very much, Tom. You know, Clinton was a politician. He was an aristocrat, member of Parliament. I think that he knew exactly what he was doing when he made those decrees, because I think that part of the Southern strategy in his mind was what he had been sold by William Campbell and Tryon, is that there's all these loyalists there. They were doing a Vietnamization of the war. And so the first thing you got to do is restore citizenship. Then you just get them back into their old loyalist or royal militia units, and then you've got the manpower to go after the rebels. I think Clinton, after he landed in Kiowa or Seabrook or wherever down there, and saw the ferociousness and the amount of warfare around Charleston in the siege. I mean, Charleston didn't fall like that. It was a full-blown military siege, and they had a bunch of soldiers down there. I think Clinton was smart enough to know that the South wasn't going to just fall like that. He knew that he needed thousands more soldiers than he had, and the only place to get them was to turn these good South Carolinians back into royal militias, provincial troops, and go. His boy Ferguson, that's why, Ferguson was one of his proteges. He put Ferguson in the field very early on and said, go to the back country, let's bring these loyalist militias, because that's how they were going to win the South, with our own people. It didn't work.
No.
No, it didn't.
Thank you very much for the insight, and I'm afraid we're going to have to draw this one to a close. The motel people need to get in here and set things up for later on tonight. So, what more can I say? Thank you for your participation.
Two folks we wanted to make this presentation to have had to go back to Seabrook tonight, so they aren't here. But a couple months ago, Anne Marie Marshall called and said, when I was raising money for, I think it was Independence Square project in Philadelphia, I found people that would sponsor things, and I think it's time that somebody sponsored a mural for you. So I would like to sponsor a mural for Don. Well, what evolved was that they both sponsored it for each other as their Valentine gift to each other. And they said, if we do this as outsiders, surely the local folks will see the need and the good that's coming from the program, and they'll step up and we'll set the pace for them. So we have a picture of the mural on the McLeod grocery store in Paxville. If you haven't seen it, it's over there. And the little sign will say, during the American Revolution, November 1780, Colonel Tarleton and his Green Dragoons hunted General Marion. Marion and his militia departed from Richburg's Mill, fought a series of delaying actions and rode to the head of Jacks Creek and then down to the Pocatalico River. The rest you pick up from our first mural on the fire station in Manning, where the Swamp Fox got his name. Our thanks to Don and Anna Marie Marshall of Silver Lakes Plantation for donating the Swamp Fox mural in Paxville. Okay. When we were coming up with what we were going to do tonight for the theater, it was suggested that we do John Rutledge. And what a tremendous idea. Because here was a gentleman that truly had just a terrible task. He barely escaped from Charleston. He had no government. He had a bunch of wild men out there running around in the swamps calling themselves militia leaders. And he had to bring this whole thing together. And he had no headquarters to go to. He was just on the run. And so to introduce this and set the scenario for you, we have lady that's famous across the stage, the screens of the world, on videos, and publisher of 3, soon to be 4 books, Dr. Christine Swager.
We've been hearing about the military leaders of the revolution, and so tonight, and we've not heard anything about a politician until tonight. Let me read this quote. The most gifted and devoted leader of the ruling group of the 18th century South Carolina, John Rutledge embodied, perhaps more perfectly than any other man, the ideas of his class. Now, as George said, the seat of government was in Rutledge's saddle, and the affairs of the state were conducted from the papers in his saddlebag. Tonight, we have, for your pleasure, a presentation by Governor Rutledge himself. And our visitor is brought to us by the artistic and scholarship of one of our own. Those of you who were here other years know Dr. Joseph Stukes as Francis Marion. Tonight, he will be Governor Rutledge. Dr. Stukes is retired from Francis Marion University. Isn't that appropriate? And he is a professor emeritus of history. Now, he's appeared in many venues as many historic personages. He's a regular on the Chautauqua circuit, where he has enlightened and delighted many people who love their history. Now, Governor Rutledge appears here in his later years, and he will reminisce about his career. I should warn you that in the last years, he showed signs of insanity and was forced by his derangement from public life. Now, you people in the front should not be afraid because, although Governor Rutledge may be a bit peculiar, he is not dangerous. So let me introduce to you Governor John Rutledge of South Carolina.
Well, I'm glad to see you all here. They told me that you would come, and they wanted me to help remember about the year 1780. Well, sometimes these days it's difficult for me to remember, but I think I remember 1780. These days, I do not function as well as I did. People say that I am eccentric and that I am forgetful and that I am sometimes guilty of macabre things. But I was not always old, nor was I always forgetful, nor did I always do macabre things. I was born here in Charleston, 1739. Don't know which day, maybe today, 1739. And here it is in 1800. We want to talk about 1780. Well, I was 40 then, because I'm 60 now. Before I was 40, though, I had been born into a good family here. My parents had 7 children in their 10 years of marriage. I was the oldest. My brother Edward, he's 11 years younger than I. He was the last of the children, of course. When I grew up and married, my wife and I had 10 children, 8 of whom survived. Even though my father was dead, my mother, who was wealthy in her own right, plus the wealth that my father had accumulated, plus the benevolence of an uncle, there was plenty of money. They sent me to England. I studied law over there. I studied in the inner temple, ends of the court. I was a serious student. And I was very, very much a pleasure to my professor. I also loved the theater. I attended frequently. And I particularly liked the actor David Garrick. David Garrick was popularizing an English playwright who had lived a century and a half before, William Shakespeare. And I went frequently to the theater to see the Shakespeare plays, both at the Globe and at the Downtown Theater that Garrick popularized himself. But when I finished, instead of staying in England and practicing law in England, I came back to Charleston. Almost immediately, I had more law practice than I could handle. I was well trained. As a matter of fact, there was no other lawyer in all of Charleston as well trained as I. And my mind was a logical mind. I never forgot anything. I was always ready. And I won practically all of the suits. After a couple of years, I decided to marry. I married Elizabeth Grimke. We decided one day to marry, and we stopped by St. Michael's Church. And we spoke to the priest, and he married us. He had two of his servants to be witnesses. And then I carried Elizabeth to the home where my mother lived to introduce her to my mother as her daughter-in-law. And it made my mother furious. She had planned that her eldest son would have the most gala of all the weddings Charleston had ever seen. And here I suddenly appeared already married. I think my mother never really forgave me that. As I told you, Elizabeth and I had 10 children. The oldest one is John Jr. The youngest daughter, Sarah later married the son of my best friend, Henry Lawrence. Married Henry Jr. My friend Henry had a tragedy in his life that his second son, whom he had named Henry, had died as a child in a foolish prank, childhood prank, leaping from the roof of one building to the roof of the other building. And his foot slipped and he fell to his death. And so when the next son was born in the Lawrence family, he too was named Henry. And that's the one who became my son-in-law. It's been a great joy to have the families connected. Another one of my sons married a Pinckney. And so the families sort of all got connected. But I was the one who went into politics early. I thought it was my duty. It's the civic virtue, the duty to serve the community, to serve the area, to serve the state. And so I was elected to the legislature. And then in 1765, when Parliament over there in England passed the stamp tax, which meant that they would tax the colonies without their consent, I felt that my right as an Englishman was being violated. And it was my civic duty to help with the protest. I went to the Stamp Act Congress, sent there by the people of Charlestown. I was the youngest man ever. I was still in my 20s when I went to the Stamp Act Congress. And I was one of those who helped draft the document that we sent to the King and to Parliament, protesting the fact that they were violating our rights as Englishmen by passing direct taxes upon us when we were not represented in the taxing body. I was pleased when, although the stamps were here, although the stamps were in Charleston, we were able to hide those stamps. We never sold them in Charleston. And then we heard that the Stamp Act had been rescinded. We had considerable trouble with the King's government in Charleston. The King would send us governors who were unsympathetic with our way of life, unsympathetic with the problems of living in a colonial area. Our only weapon was to withhold the salary of the King's governor. And this we did until occasionally the governor would cooperate with us as we thought he should. The only weapon we had then was withholding the salary. When the tea came in 1773, It was a real problem for us. We didn't know whether to land that tea or not. We knew it had happened in Boston. The news came quickly. And I was afraid that we might engage in Charleston in a rash act, as they had done in Boston. It was on my suggestion that we landed the tea, but that we stashed it all in the basement of the Exchange building in Charlestown and sold not a bit of the tea. So that the problem about, again, being taxed and taxed on the basis of tea was solved. And I was one of those who rejoiced when, after things had fallen apart and there was war between the colonies and Great Britain, that then we sold the tea as a charity. As the proceeds, we bought powder and ammunition, and we sent that to the British in return. We also sent, shortly after the tea tax, and Parliament had passed the Boston Port Bill, which closed the port of Boston and threatened that great city with starvation. We sent produce. We sent supplies. We were the first colony to send supplies to Boston. We sent them by ship. And we aided Massachusetts in its time of trouble. Cooperation between the colonies. It later bore fruit for us. But we had first been the one to collaborate. When in 1775, the First Continental Congress was called, I was elected as one of the delegates. I went. I found that there were radicals up there. Radicals who were ready to go for independence. Well, I was opposed to what Britain was doing, but I was an Englishman. I was a great admirer of the British way of life. I didn't want independence. I wanted my rights as Englishmen. And so I helped frame, once more, a petition. This one sent both to the Parliament and to the King, reminding them that they were overstepping the rights of those of us who lived in the colonies. It was a moderate document, not a radical one. My friend Christopher Gadsden was furious with me. Gadsden was a radical, ready to do what he wanted to do. My new friend Henry Lawrence, a man who took care of my business affairs in great amounts. Henry Lawrence was like I was, not ready for independence, but certainly ready to protect our local rights. And when we heard that they had been actually fighting in Massachusetts, up there in Concord, Massachusetts, and in Lexington, Massachusetts, there in the Continental Congress, it was time for us to find someone who could rally what militia we had to form them into an army, to give armed resistance to the British, who would not heed our pleas for mercy and for justice. I was one of those who, in conjunction with others, suggested that we name George Washington to be our commander-in-chief. Mr. Washington accepted that position. And as you will remember, he was our commander-in-chief throughout the war. I wasn't there the day the Declaration of Independence was signed. My brother was, Edward, my youngest brother. Other people were friends of mine. I heard about it when I was in Charlestown. And I will confess that I shed a tear of deep regret. It meant that we cut the ties with the greatest empire in the world. Probably greater than the empire of the Romans 1,800 years ago. It seemed to me that we ought to be able to get along. But on the other hand, experience showed us that we were not going to get along. That the Parliament, which should be our friend, our father, our mother, our helping brother, was indeed totally cold to the needs of the colonies. They looked upon us not as citizens of the empire, but as workers for the empire. And they expected the wealth that we produced to go not to ourselves and not to the empire as a whole, but to England. So I didn't sign the Declaration. I wish we hadn't had it. But once it was signed, it was my duty, of course, to follow along. The king had announced that we as colonies were in rebellion. King George III had called us rebels. I didn't think we were rebels. I thought we were citizens of the empire who were protesting wrongs. And all we wanted to do was to set the wrongs right. But after the Declaration of Independence, and after the king announced that we were rebels, we needed to make our own government. Following the suggestion of the Continental Congress, we had a convention in our state, and we established a Republic of South Carolina. A republic. The Constitution of 1776. We met in convention. We wrote as a convention a constitution. We said that the people would elect a lower house, and the lower house would elect an upper house, and that the two houses together would vote to choose a president and a vice president. There were 5 names suggested. And the rules that we had set up said that the one who had the most votes would be the president, and the one who had the next most votes would be the vice president. And all those who were voting aye received 162 votes. My friend Henry Lawrence received 160 votes. And so we were president and vice president of the Republic of South Carolina. But we had said in the document itself, in the preamble, that this would be a temporary government. Temporary government, until we could settle the differences. But the differences did not go away. We were not able to settle the differences. 2 years later, it was beyond recall. Within those 2 years, they had been fighting not only in Massachusetts, but fighting along the coast, and the fighting in Sullivan's Island. I was the president of South Carolina. General Washington, on his behalf, had sent a General Lee, a General Charles Lee, who had experience as a British general, who came with the greatest of credentials. And Charles Lee came down to Charlestown to help us defend ourselves. And, of a certainty, the fleet came. The British fleet. They were ready to take Charleston by sea. We had a half-finished fort on Sullivan's Island. General Lee sent word to my boyhood friend, William Moultrie, sent word to William Moultrie to destroy the fort and fall back. And when I heard that that had been done, I just could not see how that was right. And so I, as president of South Carolina, sent the message to William Moultrie: do not fall back. Complete the fortifications there. And if the British try to attack, defend. Well, the British did try to attack. They tried to attack by land, and because of the lack of maps, they ended up in the swamps. They were unable to come from Long Island across to Sullivan's Island, and so they tried to come by ship. They tried to bombard the fort. They did bombard the fort, but the fort stood. And the fort returned fire and damaged several of the British ships and sank one. The young man who commanded the artillery was a young farmer whose name was Francis Marion. And he commanded that artillery with great skill, conserving his ammunition and finding excellent aim. And when one of the British shells hit the staff on which our flag, our blue flag, with a rising crescent moon on it, and that flag hit the ground, this young man, William Jasper, leaped across what protection there was from the palmetto logs, took the flag, and fastened it high again. And after the battle, I sent a hogshead of rum to the men, and I sent my own sword as a reward to William Jasper. And it was a disappointment when, but a few weeks later, William Jasper, now a sergeant, was killed in fighting in Savannah. I had much trouble with Charles Lee. Charles Lee had come with all the reputation, but all the military orders that he'd given seemed to me to be wrong. And even though he had the reputation of a military man, and of course I had never been on a battlefield before in all my life, but I was the president of the Republic, and so I countermanded him. We didn't get along at all. As a matter of fact, Charles Lee went back, and as you may remember, he and George Washington didn't get along at all. In 1778, that is, after 2 years as the president of the Republic of South Carolina, we realized that independence was a fact. It was time for us to establish not a temporary republic, but establish a government in which we would cooperate with the other colonies as one of the states, to be united together in our resistance to the British. So in 1778, the legislature that had been created by the Constitution of 1776 wrote a constitution in which they established us as a state and created the office of governor. I pondered over that. As a lawyer, I realized that the legislature has no right to write a constitution. It takes a convention of the people. It's not that the people's representatives who are elected to act on all measures affecting the state. Constitutions have to be written by conventions who are elected for the sole purpose of writing a constitution. And even though I was the president of the Republic, I found that I needed to veto and challenge. There was no veto available. And so when I addressed the legislature, and I said to them, you are the provincial Congress. You are not a constitutional convention. And since I cannot stop you any other way, I offer my resignation. And it stunned them. They turned to Arthur Middleton. And Arthur decided that he would not accept the job as president or as governor of the new state. And then they turned to Rutledge Lowndes. And Mr. Lowndes accepted. I went back, as a matter of fact, I came back to this very house. Elizabeth and I had built this house on Broad Street, number 116. The best house on Broad Street in Charleston. I resumed my practice of law. It was almost more than I could handle. As my friend Henry Lawrence was at work at 5 a.m. every day, so was I at work at 5 a.m. every day. I did a great amount of work. I piled up a great amount of credits. Not money, credits. And with those credits, I bought a good bit of land. As a matter of fact, at the height, I owned 173,000 acres of South Carolina land. A good bit of it around, I owned 29 lots in Charleston City. The rest of it scattered throughout the low country, but also some land up in the 96th district. We anticipated the expansion of the state. Well, I knew it from the start. Mr. Lowndes was a vacillator. He never could quite make up his mind. And particularly in crises, Rutledge Lowndes just never knew what to do. And after he had stumbled along as the governor of the state for 11 months, he resigned. We had a new election. Altogether, in the combined houses, there were 163 votes. And I received 154 votes. And so I became the governor of South Carolina. 1778. 1778. And you wanted to talk about 1780. It came quickly. It was the worst year for the colony of South Carolina, for the Republic of South Carolina, and for the state of South Carolina. In May, despite the fact that General Washington had sent us a new leader, a better leader than Lee, in my opinion, but who was not better, in my opinion. His name was Benjamin Lincoln, a big man from Massachusetts, a man who in battle had already been wounded, and he limped on his left leg. He had been on the battlefield. His courage was not questioned. His bravery was not an issue. What was an issue was the fact that he had his ideas about the military, but he listened too much to the non-military people, to the social leaders of Charlestown. And when the British came, not by sea this time, but by landing south of Charleston and moving from island to island in amphibious landings, moving up from Hilton Head and moving across to get into Charlestown itself. They were also coming from the west, overland. Time ran short. General Lincoln finally said he thought we ought to abandon Charleston, move into the interior, and to have our defense rather than being cooped up in a port city. But when that word got out, the people of Charlestown insisted that he stay and fight and save the city. Altogether, we could muster maybe as many as 4,000 men. Most of these were farmers who had come as militia, not as trained soldiers. So General Lincoln had only about 2,000. But against that 4,000, the British had at least 9,000. And they had the powerful guns that were on the ship. They bombarded us from sea as they advanced by land. My own house was hit, the old Broad Street. We ran out of food. We ran out of food for the soldiers, but also for the civilians. I finally had to order, sign the order, hated to do it, I signed the order that said that the Army could go into a private house and take what food or supplies were available within the private houses. It was a desperate situation. And then, in 1780, just as the last opportunities for flight were closing, General Lincoln suggested that I, as the governor of the state, leave Charlestown. Well, I thought that the governor of the state should not be captured by the enemy. But I also did not want to leave what looked to me like a hopeless situation. Of course, facing perhaps imprisonment as a captive of the enemy. And so I refused to leave at first, until he was able to find his other commanders. And he drafted a letter and had them all sign it, pleading with me to leave Charlestown and to carry on the government in the rest of the state of South Carolina. Faced with such an appeal, I agreed to go. Only 4 of us went. We slipped through the lines. We were fortunate not to be captured. One of those who went was my brother Edward. Others, one Pinckney, one Eugene, and the 2 of us Rutledges. And then, almost for the next 2 years, I was on the move. At first I came to Orangeburg, second city in the province. And I thought surely I could organize things in Orangeburg. Well, the people came out. But there was great resistance for folks in South Carolina who, facing the danger of the British government's forces, realized that South Carolina is a colony, fighting almost by itself. No help from North Carolina, no help from Virginia, no help from New York, no help from Massachusetts, fighting against the greatest government in the world with a powerful fleet and a just as powerful an army. And so I was not able to raise many recruits. In fact, a great number of the people in the colony, having given up hope of independence, flocked back to the British crown. They began to fly the British flag over their houses. Many of them had gone and signed documents. Those who had been captured in Charlestown, when finally that city fell, many of them signed paroles to say that they would not fight again. Later, some of them said, although not all of them, they would not only not fight against the Americans, they would fight for the British. Not just staying neutral, but actually fighting for the British. The British demanded that. And some people agreed. Not all. Not only did Charleston fall, but a few months later, in Camden, which was another one of the major cities, which the British had picked, in a battle in Camden, a terrible battle. General Washington had sent General Gates down to defend Camden. General Gates came with all the reputation of having been the victor at Saratoga. He came with all of the announcement as to what he was going to do. He had with him another general, a German, de Kalb. I had never met de Kalb, but I came to realize that he was probably the best of the generals in South Carolina at the time. But the commanding general was Gates. And in a terrible battle in August of this crucial year, 1780, Gates's army was decimated, badly defeated and scattered. Gates himself fled the area. And so we had lost two armies, one in Charlestown, one in Camden. And there were other battles round about. There was one general named Sumter who had gone up to Fishing Creek, and he was going to fight. And he tried to fight, and he was badly defeated again. It was a dark, dark time. Frankly, a lesser man than I would have been ready to quit. Added to the problem was the rumor that kept coming back, and that is that the Continental Congress up there in Philadelphia, that Continental Congress was ready to turn the three lower colonies back to England. That is to give us South Carolina and also Georgia and also North Carolina back as colonies to England in order for the rest of the colonies to be independent. I heard this rumor, as did others. I even wrote the Continental Congress and said, you need to make some statement about this. Frankly and gratefully they did. They denied that there was any such plan to cut the colonies in any way and give some of them back without question to the British. But it was unnerving. But one thing that came, there was a bright light among all the darkness of 1780. And that was this man that I had once commended for his action in the Battle at Sullivan's Island, in what we now had begun to call Fort Moultrie. In that battle back in 76, Francis Marion had been the artillerist. And he, after having recovered from an unfortunate accident where he had badly damaged his legs, which incidentally were never strong anyway, probably from birth, his ankles had been weak and malformed. Francis Marion looked anything but like a general. His arms were a little too long, reaching close to his knees. He had a hawk nose. He was not as tall as most people. He was of lesser stature than most. And he was slender. He looked like anything but a gentleman. But there was something about Francis Marion that made men rally to him. He had had experience, which other men knew, which he himself never trumpeted about, as did General Gates, for instance, and as did General Lee. But Francis Marion was able to get a few people. The first thing that he did to bring some ray of sunshine into the life of the state of South Carolina in 1780 was to intercept a group of British soldiers who were transferring prisoners that they had taken at Camden down to Charlestown. Marion, hearing of it, surprised them near Nelson's Ferry, sent the British running, captured some, and turned loose the 150 men. But there was a dark side to this new ray of sunshine. Of those 150 men, Marion gave them a choice. Either go back home and quit the war, or go on to Charleston and be a prisoner. At least you get some food down there. Or else join my band. Most of them opted to go home. That was Maryland and Delaware. About 80 of them decided that they would go on down and be prisoners. That it was better to be a prisoner than to have been a soldier and to be at the mercy of the British. Only 3 of them, only 3, joined Marion's band. But that didn't stop Marion. Within a month, at the Blue Savannah, Marion, surprised with a double envelopment, defeated the British, scattered them from a field. And another month or so, down at Black Mingo Swamp, he didn't surprise them, but he outfought them. A group of some British, but mostly Tories, under the command of a man named John Cumming Ball, a cousin of my friend Henry Lawrence. Ball escaped by running into the swamp, and he left his horse, which Marion took for his own. A big red, Marion named him Ball, rode him to the end of the war. Prisoner of war. Marion never had any men, but you know, he was not really an army man. He never had any real training as an army man. The same thing was true of Thomas Sumter, who, because his own house had been destroyed, took it personally and began to fight back. Sumter didn't win many battles, but he fought them, and he kept the British nervous. Marion won more battles, but they were always small. Marion never had really more than 50 men or so, and then occasionally when the time was right and he had sent out commands and pleas for men to join him, maybe he would get up to 100, maybe even 150, not much more ever. And he would hit and run. That's the only way we could beat the British, but that's the way we beat them. All the way through 1780. So that at the end of 1780, while the job was not yet done, things looked very, very good for South Carolina. As a matter of fact, early in 1781, Marion went on at Fort Watson, captured Fort Watson, at Fort Mott, and again later with the help of a new general from the north, General Nathaniel Greene, the 3rd general that George Washington sent to us. And with that 3rd general, we won at Eutaw Springs. Not a wonderful victory at Eutaw Springs, but a victory, a clear victory. Shortly after that wonderful year of 1780, the British now, instead of dominating Charlestown, Camden, and even 96, now they had withdrawn. And they were occupying only enclaves, Georgetown, Charlestown, further south along the islands. The British, as we know, never got over it. 1780, great, we ought to celebrate 1780. We ought to celebrate its 100th anniversary. We ought to, in the future, celebrate its 200th anniversary, its 225th anniversary. This is when South Carolina did their share. Not only along the coast, but up at Cowpens, and later at Kings Mountain. And the British were gone, except around Charleston. It was 2 years from the time that the legislature had given me absolute power. They passed a resolution back there in 1780 that said that I would have the power to give any orders in South Carolina except to take the life of a citizen without a fair trial. I never did try to take the life of a citizen without a fair trial. I did order some trials. And I did try to answer the British in their own way. On one occasion, I even suggested, because of the horrendous things, the inhuman things that the British were transparently doing to our people, I did order that it would be possible to hang a British officer who was a prisoner for every house that was burned. It sometimes happened. It sometimes happened. Finally, late in '82, we were able to have a legislative meeting. We decided to meet in Jacksonboro, not far from Charlestown. We couldn't meet in Charlestown, the British were still there. But we met there in Jacksonboro, and with some more fighting, and with the fact that the British were losing now up around Boston and New York and the rest of America, and the fact that they grew tired of the war, we were finally able to make arrangements for the British to abandon Charlestown. They were able to take with them some of the loyalists who had fought with the British and all the loyalist belongings. It took 300 British ships to take away the Tories that wanted to leave South Carolina. 300 ships. There were over 4,000 Tories who left. But now, South Carolina was a free and independent state. Some Tories stayed. And we decided that we needed to punish those Tories for what they had done during the war. Because some Tories had left, we confiscated some of the plantation. As a matter of fact, we confiscated 237 by name and another 250 by category. The state now owned all this land. It was the way we paid a good many soldiers, by giving them the land. We didn't confiscate everybody's estate. We amerced some, as much as 12% of their total worth. 47 by name, 47. And about another 50 by category. And in this way, we tried to say, if the war was over, the debts are settled. We also had to pass a law to give debt relief to those who had piled up debts during the wartime. And we passed one law that protected the soldiers, the general officers, in case they had committed some sort of crime during the war in the name of the war. General Sumter was delighted at that. General Sumter needed protection. I never had liked him. But he was in the field. Men were following him. And he had accomplishments. And so I had promoted him as a general. I had promoted him before I promoted Francis Marion, which caused a little problem between the two of them. Francis Marion didn't like Thomas Sumter either. Francis Marion didn't want to obey Thomas Sumter's orders, which Thomas Sumter was wont to give. We had difficulties settling, but we did. I returned to Charlestown. I served out my term as governor. I was unable to succeed myself after the 2 years. One of my friends, John Matthews, was elected as the governor. I was pleased. I later entered the lower house, elected from Charlestown. I also went back to practicing law. Once more, I made a lot of money on paper, but I owed a lot of money on paper. I was even sued by people in Charlestown to collect the debts that I owed them. It was an embarrassing situation. Embarrassing. But the Articles of Confederation that we were living under as a government didn't protect us. It was obvious we needed a better government than we were having, with each individual state being individual, with its sovereignty intact. And so when a convention was called in 1787 to amend the Articles, that's what it said, amend the Articles, in South Carolina, we elected 5 persons to go to Philadelphia to this convention to amend the Articles. I was one of those elected. So was my brother, Edward. Arthur Middleton was elected. Thomas Ledge was elected. And my friend Henry Lawrence was elected. Henry, unfortunately, as he was on a diplomatic mission, had been captured at sea and had spent time in the Tower of London. So when the Constitution was finally written by this organization that was supposed to only amend the Articles, but presumed to write a new Constitution, Henry was not there to sign. We left a space for him on the Declaration for his name to be put, and it never was put. So 4 men from South Carolina Middleton, Lynch, and Rutledge signed the document. I was pleased to be very effective in that Constitutional Convention. I helped calm things, but I helped make sure that the Southern interests were protected. Charles Pinckney, who was also concerned, Charles Pinckney, who was also there, made suggestions about the Constitution. We finally got it done. We were satisfied now. We were now the United States. And the United States was promoting people. My name was suggested as a possible vice president, along with George Washington, whom everybody chose to be the president. Alas, there was a backstage politicking in Philadelphia and throughout the states. And it was suggested that since Washington was a Southerner, Virginia counted as one of the Southern colonies, now states, they needed someone from the North. And so the job of vice president went to John Adams. And so I said to my friend George Washington, reminding him that I was one of those who had him appointed as commander-in-chief in the first place, a few years before, I suggested to him that I might enjoy being the Chief Justice of the United States Court. But alas, that had to go to a man from a middle state. And so they took John Jay for that. So I returned to South Carolina. I tried to pick up my life. My mother was still alive. We were living in this very house, 116 Broad Street. It had been damaged because British had lived here during the war, but my mother had been allowed to live in that house too. General Leslie, the British leader, had been kind to my mother. On their first occasion, when she came into the house where he had already taken it over, he offered her tea and she refused. He offered her wine and she refused. He offered her cognac and she accepted. I was named as a judge in South Carolina. But I declined. Because even though the Chief Justice job in the federal government went to John Jay, my friend Washington appointed me as an associate justice. And so I was a judge of the Supreme Court, but not the chief, of the very first Supreme Court. It meant that I had to ride circuit twice a year. And the circuit went all the way up to Pennsylvania and down into Georgia. It was time consuming. It was wearing. And so, after 2 years, I resigned as Associate Justice of the Supreme Court and took the job of Chief Justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court. I had to ride circuit in South Carolina, but it was not so bad. I did not have the reputation of being punctual. And occasionally, in their power, a grand jury would even send presentments against the judge himself. But on one occasion, the grand jury presented me with the fact that I was not in the courtroom at 10 o'clock. And I called the grand jury together and I marched into the room and I let them know, gentlemen, it is never 10 o'clock until I am in this room. But my health began to fail. My mother and my wife died the same year, 1792. My mother died first, and my wife was not ill. But she collapsed so quickly. It almost to call it a sudden death. And those who had been my creditors in the past began to press upon me for payment. And it bothered me, it worried me. I couldn't sleep. I was unable to pay. I began to sell off my lands. And finally, my son, John, and my brother, Edward, came to me and made me sign a paper which gave them power of attorney over my holdings. And I grew sicker and sicker. And that's when they began to say that I was eccentric. in that I was forgetful. For 3 years after my wife died, I lived alone, taken care of by house servant and slave. And then in 1795, in a bit of depression, I waded out into the Ashley River until it was over my head, and I intended to stay there. People along the shore saw they were black, and they fished me out of the river. They carried me to James Blake's house, and James and his family nursed me back to health. I found that I didn't have many lands left. And I didn't have any law practice anymore. And I found that I couldn't remember. Sometimes I couldn't remember John Jr.'s name. And I grew weaker and weaker. And I have lived in my memories. They're wonderful memories. 1780, among the others, is what you came to talk about. And I think that there are a few days left. After all, I'm 60. But in those few days, I'll remember the past days. And give thanks for them and for tomorrow. God bless you and South Carolina.
Mr. President, sir, there are people here that fought with us during the Revolution who have ridden from Georgia and even Massachusetts to be with you and hear you tonight. Sir, would you entertain just a few questions before you retire?
First, I would like to salute them and all the others who spent those dangerous days in 1780, but in other days as well. And I salute you. So much for him. If anybody has a question they think I can answer.
We have one question over here, Dr.
Well, I'll
Stukes.
make sure I can answer it.
Yeah, I'm sure you can, sir, since it concerns you personally and immediately.
All right.
Before Charleston fell, there was another assault on the city a year earlier.
Yes?
At that moment, it appeared Charleston would fall, and you sent a message to the British commander offering to withdraw South Carolina from the war and remain neutral for the remainder of the war if they just leave Charleston alone.
Yes, they were well trained, and
Yeah, I know. It doesn't stop,
I've never heard of it, but I like absinthe. Here we go, sir.
Taxi!
Well, how you doing, old
Gordon?
What is that mean?
That sounds
Well, we can get them that off the road, which is up front of the building.
Can I help you? I'm looking for Jonathan Devereaux.
Mr. Devereaux's out right now. He'll be back tonight for the party.
Well, is Maddie here?
I don't believe I know you, ma'am. Maybe you'd like to leave a message.
Go? Down by the dock. Yeah. Concierge here at the hotel. Go right up St. Anne.
It's certainly a pleasure having you stay with us here at the Montanoni, Mrs. Scratch.
There. My suite has a view.
Your room has a lovely view of the Mississippi, Mrs. Scratch.
And I need a masseuse.
I'll send Jerome right up. Bruce? 1420, Mrs. Scratch. Hello.
I'm sorry, are you lost?
No, actually, I'm found. I just had an hour with Jerome.
Oh, Jerome. I've heard that he is marvelous.
He's fabulous. I haven't felt this good since the day my husband died. So I've got something for tonight, but I think I need Armani.
Yes, very good, Mrs.
Critch, Suite 1420.
Of course.
I'll be charging it to my room.
Now, Mrs. Critch, I would say that you are a size 4?
A 2.
Of course.
Find out and get it right back to you, right?
I'm thinking
There's a guy waiting for you.
Yeah, they pulled that all out already.
That's all the paperwork on it, but I ain't done that no more.
What's that?
Did you catch that thing? What'd you use for bait?
I caught that big bucket mouth son of a bitch off an old rebel lure my daddy left me. Of course, there's buzz bombs, poppers, jigs, all kinds of things work back in these waters. I'm Jim Mango.
Travis Lehman, Washington Department of Corrections.
What can I do for you? Who's this?
That's somebody I'm looking for.
Pretty girl?
Oh, yeah, she's very pretty for a convicted murderer.
Mr. Lehman, I'd love to be able to help you, sir.
No, I don't want you guys to go any trouble. I can handle matters. I just came down as a professional courtesy since she's in New Orleans and she came here to kill one of your prominent citizens.
And just how's she planning on doing that?
I don't know. She'll probably use the 38 special she stole from me.
Roy Lee, get these in the works now.
Here's something you don't see McDonald's doing, doubling their menu. But that's exactly what Subway Restaurants is doing. Now every sub they make, you can get toasted or untoasted. The choice is yours.
Try the great taste of our low-fat savory turkey sub, now fresh toasted. Subway, eat fresh.
Looking for a fresh solution in bladder protection? Then take a look at our new improved Serenity Pads from Tenna with Odosor Plus to help prevent odors, and a unique soft top sheet with multi-inlets that absorb liquid faster than ever before. Serenity feels dry. You feel fresh.
Let's face it, how much fun you have this summer depends on what you add to it. And nothing will add more to your summer than a trip to Radio Shack's Memorial Day sale. Hey, every summer needs a soundtrack, and here's your chance to get yours. How about an over 120-channel digital quality Sirius satellite radio? On your way to summer, make sure you pass through Radio Shack. There's one around every corner. The Memorial Day sale at Radio Shack. For 4, count them now, 4 days only.
Oh, plugged out from a cold or allergies? Take your medicine and use Sudicare Vapor Plug, a tiny waterless vaporizer releasing soothing vapors all night long. Sudicare Vapor Plug, from the makers of Sudafed.
Because the new Dyson rides on a ball, it turns and maneuvers unlike any other vacuum. So now, turning your vacuum is as simple as a turn of your wrist. And of course, it doesn't lose suction.
You go to my head, yellow. You sweet chocolate fellow, green. Such a beauty queen, orange. Sorry, kid, nothing rhymes with orange. Chocolate is better in color.
A 210 horsepower PowerTech V6, 2 available four-wheel drive systems, 5,000-pound towing capacity, and one feature that really attracts attention. The new 2005 Jeep Liberty.
You can't put a price on health, but you can take up to 50% off at the GNC Memorial Day sale. Buy any GNC product and get 50% off a second GNC product. Now through Monday. What's your goal? Bring it to GNC.
See the show where you're fired means you win. 2 people compete to get fired on TV's funniest new reality show. Fire Me Please, CBS Tuesday, June 7th.
Dave's got Ben Stiller, Britney Spears, and Kevin Federline tomorrow.
It's the 43rd Annual Memorial Day Sale at Love Chevrolet, where you'll find the lowest prices of the year on the largest new car and truck inventory in the Carolinas. Featuring Love's Truck Central, huge savings on hundreds of brand new O5s, every type, style, and color. The 43rd Annual Love Chevrolet Memorial Day Sale going on now at 1255 Knox Ave. More cars, more trucks, lowest prices, guaranteed.
That's the power of love. Love Chevy.
If your wish is to be free from unsightly and painful varicose veins or spider veins, Vein Specialists of the South can make it a reality. Vein Specialists of the South use the latest and most effective techniques in a comfortable office setting. Walk in, walk out with little or no downtime. Dr. Neil Reynolds is a board-certified surgeon who's been helping his patients enjoy life again in Columbia for over 25 years. Call for an appointment today or visit our website.
This is the Civic Value Package from Honda. And this is a gallon of regular unleaded gasoline. The Civic can get up to 38 miles on just one of these. And with a full tank, the Civic has a range of up to 500 miles. Given the rising cost of gasoline these days, we just thought